So let me tackle the constraint issue. The constraint issue is best visualized like an hourglass, okay? So you have upstate New York that has excess generation right now. You have the choke point that we've discussed ad nauseum. And then you have the new capacity zone that, if you will, doesn't have enough sand in it. So you have you have really only two options. Either with transmission expand the middle of the hourglass, or you add sand directly to the bottom. Either way works. It's a deliverability issue of the demand that's required here, okay? So generation works, and in fact, generation, I don't want to start a real food fight, but because the reliability rules state that Central Hudson has to purchase 88% of their power within the zone to mitigate the loss of a transmission line. So what that means is the generation's local. So they've got to buy 88% of what's called the locational capacity requirement. Con Ed has to do 85% in the city. And what that does is when there's a thunderstorm, if the line goes down, you can still keep the lights on, because you're probably at 85%, 88%, you're probably not at peak demand. And so you'd have enough generation to keep the lights on if you lost transmission capability. So you have a locational purchasing requirement, or capacity requirement, if you will. But alleviating the choke point is no different than an hourglass. You either make it bigger or you add at the bottom. And so generation and or transmission would work. Now, whether that generation's renewables, I would restate this again, and I'm not sure I'm getting it across, but we have modified our markets. We lead the nation, if not the world, in integrating renewables into our markets. There's nothing preventing them from coming in. All that's preventing them from coming in is someone coming in and doing it. We're not standing in the way. We're not saying it has to be a gas power plant. We're not saying it can't be solar. You know, we're just not, we're not a policymaker, and we're not a bank. We don't lend the money. We set the markets. So there's nothing preventing those things from happening. And so if there is something, at least from our world, if there's a policy that you want to change, then that's a different discussion with a different group. But we don't say wind or solar can't come in here.
Move.
One plug in.
Excuse me?
Can I put a plug in?
Sure.
Just remember that phrase, on-bill financing. You heard that it's available for solar. I would encourage you to talk to our NYSERDA contractor in the back, because you can get money to help you conserve, and it's not going to cost you anything monthly. Vote with your feet.
One more person down that way, and we're going to move over this way. Okay. Trying to work our way over.
My question is for Mr. Den. Is the PSC, have they addressed, or are they doing anything about the timeline of these projects? Because there's a lot of people that are in limbo with their houses not being able to sell that are on the proposed corridors. And it seems to me that it's in National Grid's best interest to drag this process out as long as possible, because they seem to be the only ones that are getting paid right now, currently, transmitting the power.
The plan is to very soon have what we could call new initial proposals submitted to the commission in a very short period of time, which will provide some of that specificity that you're looking at. But before that happens, on March 26th, as I mentioned, some new statements of intent will be submitted, and then the Public Service Commission, along with the developers, will be going out on the road to solicit additional public input on these plans. So in the very near future, you might see us, the developers, back here, and the developers will be putting up their new initial proposals, and we'll have that kind of interaction that you're looking for. So we're hoping that sooner, much sooner rather than later, we'll have this.
Is there a time frame on sooner?
We're March 26th. We're going to have some a time frame.
Here? Where? Here?
You mean locations for these meetings? Not yet, but well, as you all know, I mean, we've been on the road. I've seen many. We've been a lot of communities. So.
He's on a first name basis. Are you sir, why don't you come on?
Hi, I'm John O'Malley from Rock Tavern. I want to thank everybody for coming today for this informative information. As I understand this, with the bottleneck and the capacity problem that we have, the solution that we've selected, or the solution that we're encouraging, is to raise the rates so that companies will provide service. And I'm a little confused because I'm looking at a news release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from February of 2014, which discusses the average energy prices in New York as compared to the national average. And it has 3 sections, one on gasoline, gallons of gasoline, one on electricity, and one on natural gas. And the one on electricity says that for the past 5 years, New York has been paying 50% more than the national average as it is. And that this past January of 2014, we're paying 73.1% more than the national average. So my question is, if we're already paying more than the national average, number one, where'd all that money go? Number two, why do we have to bribe these companies with even higher rates when they should be able to find a market where the rates are now?
Thank you. Who'd like to tackle that?
I'll be glad to start, but this is really a joint discussion between us and the PSC. With the ISO markets, in your rate, in your bill, there are 3 components: taxes, assessment fees, roughly a third, the delivery charges, which are the transmission, roughly a third, and the generation, roughly a third. As I said, in 2012, the wholesale cost was lower than it was 12 years ago, but your rate has not gone down, right? So of the third that the markets have established, they've gone down. They're low, and that's not price adjusted, inflation adjusted, no magic, just dollar per kilowatt hour, cheaper in 2012 than in 2000. But the rate's not gone down, and that's a retail discussion that we don't. Our world isn't the retail world. Ours is strictly the wholesale. I would point out one thing. The rate is half the equation of your bill, of the check you write, the check I write to National Grid. Our rate is in the top 5 typically. Hawaii is always number 1, Connecticut typically 2, and we're between 3 and 5. But we're in New York, 49th in the country on usage per capita, only behind Rhode Island. Only Rhode Island uses less electricity per person than New York State. And the reason is we have a lot of people living in apartment buildings instead of single-family homes. So you take the rate times how much you use, and that's how much you're writing your check for. And that tends to be roughly right along the national, right around 25, between 23 and 27 typically. So the money that you're paying every month is right at the national average. The rate's very high, but it's because the denominator is controlled by people that use, again, other than Rhode Island, less than anyone else in the country. And so it's important, at least to me, what I care about is what I write my check for. And right now, it's about national average. But the retail side, I'll let Jim address, because I think that's a fair question.
Again, I would turn to a slide that Tom put up, which shows how our emissions in the state are so much lower than the national average. We should be very proud of the fact that New York is a cleaner state than other states which burn a lot of coal. And the fact that we are cleaner costs more money. And that, and on top of the fact that we are in an urban environment, our costs are higher than other states, other rural states. So those are some of the factors that you're looking at. And renewable energy, we have a very aggressive renewable energy program. We have a very aggressive energy efficiency program. And these are all factors which go into adding to the rates that we all pay day in and day out.
I'm looking for somebody that hasn't asked before because I want to be fair to everyone. That gentleman in the back, I think you have a purple shirt.
Years ago, we were, if I had solar panels, I could only resell back to Central Hudson or a Denmark company, actually, global corporation. And the words Central Hudson should not be used. Anyway, I could not sell back to Central Hudson. Point I'm getting at is all the shopping centers The schools that were shut down because the coal plant was shut down should have had solar panels on them, and the excess being sold into the grid. Why aren't the shopping centers? They're still outlawed from having solar panels, but there's deregulation? For who? The corporate citizenry or the physical body people public?
Anyone want to comment on
Only because I made the comment on the schools. They weren't closed because of electricity. They were closed because of the tax base that was lost when dance came closed. It wasn't the power. So I just want to clarify that. I have no idea about the solar structure in this area. I know where I'm at. I sell it back to these guys at retail and buy wholesale, which works out for me.
There's a hiding question over there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, sorry. He hasn't asked anything before.
Hi, my name is Albert Vasco. I'm from Clinton Concerned Citizen, Dutchess County, and I just want to thank you guys for having us. I want to ask ISO, the relationship between the transmission upgrade that we're proposing, talking about it, and the rate hike. Okay, what is the relationship? Is there a relationship between the two? And I guess this next question is, if one of these transmission upgrades were chosen today, we made a decision, we all agreed on what's going to happen, what would that do to the FERC rate hike as far as the ISO goes? And FERC, like, what would happen tomorrow? Let's say, what would happen? You know, if it happened right
Fair
now.
enough.
Okay, that's my question.
Sure. So there's two questions, and I don't want to sparse things because I try to answer questions as directly. I think at least Ron's come to appreciate that over the years. When transmission goes in, that is put into a rate, and that goes to the rate payer. It shows up in your bill as part of your delivery charge. When the transmission goes in, unless it's merchant. Now, there's one transmission line that is merchant, the Champlain Hudson, that's coming in right in. It's the DC line that they talked about earlier. That's merchant. That won't go into your rate. They are coming into the market like a generator. What they're saying is, if we build this transmission line, we can sell hydro from Canada into New York City and make money. We don't want ratepayer money, okay? When generation comes in, it's not, in other words, the new capacity zone, it's not a rate that they get. There's no guarantee that they're gonna make money. When they come in, if they screw up the project, that's on them. The rate payers aren't, you don't own that risk. So the question, I sparse on rate because if and when the transmission comes in and you see a rate increase, I don't want you to think that I was lying to you. The transmission, when it comes in, they're not merchant. These are going to be rate-based transmission projects that will show up in your delivery charge at some level. Now, if we had 1,000 megawatts come in tomorrow, whether it was transmission, generation, whatever it was, let me use the number that's more appropriate, 1,600, no matter whatever source, then you would see zero increase based on the new capacity zone. It would be the same as if the new capacity zone wasn't formed. It's being formed because of that 1,600 megawatt gap between what's needed and what we can move in or generate within the zone. So transmission, generation, demand response of any kind, 1,600 megawatts is the magic number. That would alleviate the financial impacts of the capacity zone.
Aren't we shooting for 1,000 megawatts?
The energy highway is 1,000 megawatts, yes. But that's not, the energy highway wasn't, the initiative, the beginning of the energy highway was based on the age of the transmission lines needing to be replaced over the course of the next 15, 20 years. You saw in a number of presentations, it's old transmission. And so the genesis of the energy highway was, as the transmission lines age, we at the ISO said, all you utility, we can't replace these all at once for reliability reasons. You can't just shut down the transmission line. So we did what was called a STARS project, which basically looked at what's the oldest, what needs to be replaced first, and what would be the most economic way to replace them. In other words, don't replace in kind, fix the choke points as you replace them. As you put the towers back up and replace the old ones, if stringing a couple more lines gives you 1,000 megawatts of throughput, that's a significant impact on cost for consumers. So that was the energy highway. The new capacity zone was formed because FERC saw this because there's more congestion than just Leeds PV in the state. There's Central East, there's a number of them. And so even in Western New York, you're seeing congestion on Niagara. This summer there was a significant price increase around Buffalo region because of, there was a plant, Dunkirk, that filed for bankruptcy or retirement, excuse me. And so because they weren't there, we didn't have what we call reactive power enough to move the power around efficiently. And so it cost a fair amount of cost out there. So the energy highway was based on age. It will impact the new capacity zone price increases when it comes in. But most likely what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years will be more generation because it can move faster.
So you mean to tell me that even if tomorrow we pick a company,
Yeah.
we get 1,000 megawatts, that $360 FERC rate increase doesn't go away?
No, it does. It's not. What I was trying to say is what makes it zero. 1,600 megawatts makes
So you
it
tell
zero.
It works in percentage?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's linear.
It is directly related?
It is directly. Any megawatt you add down below the choke
Will
point
lower that.
will lower the cost. It's not a rate. It's not a number that someone picked. It is a sliding scale that says demand and response. Here's what it's worth, based on what it would cost to build in that zone. And all of those things were, had a lot of input from other folks.
It pays to get this. We have to do something.
You got to do something. Yeah, the bottom line is, from our view, again, we're not making money on this. We have no interest in this other than keeping the lights on, and that's true. In our interest, this last summer, 5 days in a row, we had to have companies stop using power, manufacturers. That's tough to keep business in a zone when you're doing that much. Typically, you call them once or twice a year. But demand response, people think it's just this great program, and it is. It's an awesome program. But if you're a plant manager trying to build something and someone calls you and says you can't run for 5 days, or we don't want you to run for 5 days, that's tough. That's tough.
So I understand exactly what you said, and that's great, but so really we need more than this 1,000 megawatts.
Right now, in the deliverability constraint, assuming nothing else retires or breaks, is 1,600 megawatts.
So why aren't we proposing? Why are we doing this 3 times?
Because there's there's a view that there's a combination that's the magic. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, by and large. The transmission is going to have to be replaced because of its age, no matter what, and that's if you will, a sunk cost. Now, how best to do that? The best way to do that is replace it, but also improve the throughput of the transmission. That is a 5-year process, probably. With this market signal, we've seen, and I know people don't like the generation type, but Dan Scammer's coming back from being scrapped for metal, and those megawatts are coming back this summer. That's a turnaround of 8 months. And you've got these other generation plants now that are economic to come in. Now, when you say it's on the ratepayer, that risk is on the developer. If they come in and they blast through their projects, they own that. I'm sorry.
I think we should move down. Or Jen, you want to speak?
I just want to ask you to, could you just clarify, Tom, on this 1,600 megawatts? So these are projections, right? We've had a little email back and forth about how much of this is projecting forward into the future, the need. What is, could you talk about it in terms of being a projection and also the assumptions that go into that, making that projection?
So the 1,600 megawatt issue is today. And what we're anticipating is 200 megawatts every year moving forward. So if nothing gets done next year, it's 1,800, then it's 2,000, then it's 2,200. So it's 1,600 today. That's what the study's found. And then our forecasting is the 200 megawatts moving forward. That answer your question?
Thank you, Tom. Okay. Ma'am, I don't believe you've asked a question
I
before.
have a question about the regulation of the profit margins of the utilities. This question is from PSC again. I mean, Tom has talked a lot about what happens at the wholesale level. I'm really interested in what happens at the retail level. Like, what kinds of constraints or regulations are in place? What kind of protections do we as ratepayers have?
Jim, that's your...
I'm all over that.
Yes.
The setting of rates is the bread and butter of the Public Service Commission. That is, the Public Service Commission is made up of a little bit more than 500 people, and it includes economists, lawyers, engineers, and their focus is to ensure that the rates that a utility charges are balanced between what it costs to produce and distribute the energy, as well as ensuring that the consumers are not paying too much. So typically, you're talking about the profit, what we call the rate of return. It ranges depending upon the utility, but Con Edison and Central Hudson, they all have different rates of return, but I've heard it argued that, in fact, in the state of New York, the rate of return is lower for our utilities than it is in other parts of the state. I mean, you go down to Wall Street, and Wall Street would say, hey, sometimes the rate of return for New York utilities are not as high as they should be. But, we've done a really good job at keeping this profit margin down to the lowest level that we could keep it.
So you don't know off the top of your head what it is for Central Hudson?
I don't know the current rate of return for Central Hudson.
And it's something that you look at continually? It's
Jo-
something you target?
One moment. John? 10?
10% on return on equity, not profit on the sale of electricity, but return on equity.
Return on equity.
Play with that.
ROE.
And is that something that you review every year, or
It's reviewed as part of the rate case.
which happens when?
Well, it depends.
They ask for an increase.
I think we determined the Central Hudson rate case. I don't remember when it was. John, do you?
Yeah, there's frozen until 2015, so the next filing would be likely this summer for rates to take effect in 2015.
So your rate of return was frozen.
Right.
Right. So there's an example of something that the commission did to help the consumer. They froze the company's rates. Yes, correct.
Carpool.
Hi, Tom, could you please clarify the statement you made earlier about the need to produce or to generate within the capacity zone, 85%, 88%? Because what I'm hearing is that these transmission lines are being designed to move energy from Canada, from upstate. But then I'm hearing, no, this huge amount of energy has to be generated within the zone. And that sounds contradictory to me. So I'd appreciate an explanation.
Thanks.
So the concept of a local capacity requirement, which tells a utility they have to purchase a certain amount of electricity from within a zone, is based on a number of factors. One of which is the ability of the transmission lines to move power in there. So as new transmission comes in, that locational requirement will go down. In other words, with the system conditions today, they're required to purchase 88% within this zone. When the new transmission lines come in and the quality of the transmission improves, that requirement will decrease. But it will never go to zero. Like Con Ed has an 85% requirement, and there's a couple reasons for that. Again, we'll go back to the 03 blackout. That was because a tree branch hit a wire in Ohio, right? If you think of the grid, it's like a train. Every car has to move at the same speed. That's called frequency. When one of them gets out of whack, the train comes off the rails. The only way to stop that from happening is disconnect that train, that car, if you will. When that happened in Ohio, it cascaded all the way to the ocean. So if you disconnect the transmission to prevent that from happening, you have to have sufficient generation to keep the lights on, right? And so that locational requirement is all based on a ton of inputs and assumptions, but that balancing act. As you improve the transmission, that requirement percentage comes down.
Thank you. Ma'am?
It seems like everybody in industry is pretty much in agreement about the need to upgrade transmission lines, but I'm also hearing that that's not enough, and we need more local generation. So my question is for the PSC, and if the ISO wants to comment, if there is no new capacity zone, is there going to be the incentive to increase generation? And if not, what kind of incentives or what kind of market mechanisms or what's needed to incentivize that? So I guess, like the PSC, is local generation as much of a priority for the PSC as it is for the ISO?
Well, first off, there is going to be a new capacity zone. At least that's what FERC has determined. So the Public Service Commission is appealing to FERC to reconsider that. Our answer to the new capacity zone as we've discussed, is that you can meet the need that exists in the lower Hudson Valley through transmission line upgrades. In terms of what role distributed generation is going to play, I think that's what you're getting at. You know, that is going to be things that we're going to look at in the future. But right now, as Tom correctly pointed out, you're 1,600 megawatts in the hole here, and you're not going to get it by putting up a few solar panels on a house. 1,600 megawatts is an enormous amount of energy. So we need to solve the problem. We need to solve it now, and there are some solutions that are on the table, and we look forward to community input to try to make sure we're on the right path.
Anyone else?
So I think when you saw the retirements based on the price, it's telling you that there's generation within this zone that's not competitive at the prices, and you're seeing them retire. 1,700 megawatts since 2011. From our view, the new capacity zone accurately reflects the constraints of the system. Our view was also that you don't need that economic signal day one, that you could phase it in. In our filing, we said you don't need to model. In fact, there should have been no increase to cost the first year, because nothing's going to get built that quickly. But if people know the signal's coming, it'll have the same effect. So what we asked for it to do was to phase it in, 0, 50, and then 100 on year 3. They denied that. And that's what the PSC asked for too. Their reason for that was because, and again, I'll just tell you what they had in their filing. Please don't. I'm not from FERC. Their view was, it's more than just attracting new. It's retaining what you have. Their fear was more would retire. You just had Hurricane Sandy come through. You had businesses making decisions on whether or not it was economic to recover and repair broken stuff. And that's a fair concern. And so their view was, without that signal and without that capital in the market day one, you might have more retirements. And then what are you going to do this summer if you lose another 1,000 megawatts, right? So their answer was, it's not just attract, it's retain what you have. And where you're at, you've been losing generation. And I just want to throw this out there. The capacity is 20% of a third of your bill. It's a fraction of a fraction. 3 years ago, capacity in this area was 50 cents. Right now, it's $5, right? It wasn't a dramatic, I mean, it was an uptick in your bill, but it wasn't from $100 to $200, right? So it went from 50 cents to $5 today, $5.50, and by and large unnoticed, right? Because it's a fraction of your bill, but it is an important revenue stream if someone's going to take the risk to build, particularly in New York.
Susan? Yeah.